So let's say you're working on a 3D game in GameMaker and you want to draw a sprite in 3D space for various reasons, and this may or may not come with a matrix transform to put it in the correct location that you want it to be drawn at. But let's say that in the middle of some other code you say something like draw sprites. I'm going to put it at a SPR tree subimage 0. We can just put it at 0, 0 in the room. And this should just draw a sprite at the world origin. It should just draw a sprite lying flat on the ground at the world origin. In the middle of the 3D camera, but you might find that when you do this, instead of actually getting a sprite being drawn at the world origin, you instead see in the console a million messages that say draw failed due to invalid input layout. And that's really annoying. This error message isn't the most helpful error message. It doesn't really tell you what's going on, other than that it like tanks the frame rate because it's trying to do this a million times per step and then nothing's getting drawn. All this means is that there's a mismatch between the shader that you're using and the vertex format that you're using. And the shader that you're using is looking for a vertex format attribute that isn't there. And a lot of the time when you're drawing stuff in 3D, it's going to be vertex buffers. It's going to be, a lot of the time it's going to be the same vertex buffer unless you're doing something really weird. It's probably going to look something like 3D position, 3D normal, 2D text coordinate, and a color value. And that'll be that. But if you try to do things like mix and match vertex buffers and sprites, or vertex buffers of different types of content, you might find this error popping up instead of something actually being drawn. So let's go into why that is. So the current where are we shaders, shader basic 3D stuff. The current shader that we're drawing with for most of the stuff in the 3D scene, except for the billboard of things. This is taking 4 attributes: a 3D position, a 3D normal, a 2D text coordinate, and a color value. But when you say when you tell GameMaker to draw a sprite, the internal vertex format that GameMaker uses only consists of a 3D position, yes, 3D position, even in 2D, a color value, and a texture coordinate, and there is no normal in sight. And since the shader that we're using is trying to use a normal that doesn't exist, it realizes that there's a mismatch somewhere and that it can't actually use that information that doesn't exist, and it throws up its hands in panic, and it spits out this error in the console instead of actually drawing anything. So that's pretty annoying. What it means is that you can't use the same lighting shader with sprites as you would with your other 3D objects, because sprites don't have the necessary vertex attribute. You can still use lighting on sprites, you just have to make some additional arrangements to deal with the fact that GameMaker will not supply normal when you just use the draw sprite command. This also, by the way, applies to other things such as like drawn text and stuff. In addition to sprites, if you manually draw like a tile map or something like that, you'll have the same problem. So if you were to create your own shader, and I'm just gonna create a shader, and by default, when you create a shader, the normal attribute is commented out, because it's not used. If you were to uncomment that and say shader set, let's call this shader basic 3D sprites or something like that. And if you were to try to draw, and I'm just going to get rid of this like ball drawing code because that's not relevant here. If we were to try to draw the sprite with shader set, shader basic 3D sprites, we're going to find that the problem has gone away. GameMaker is going to be fine, absolutely fine drawing this tree, even though the shader, at least on the surface, looks like it requires a normal, because the shader compiler happens to know that this input normal here isn't actually used for anything, so that it can just optimize it out, it can ignore it. If you want to do a little bit of experimentation, you can assign something like vec3 fake normal equals in underscore normal, and this is just going to, even though this isn't used, this is going to trick the shader compiler into thinking that the input normal attribute is actually used. And we're going to be back to where we were, and when we try to draw the sprite, we are going to find that GameMaker is going to be complaining again, or at least the graphics API is going to be complaining anyway. Everyone's favorite error message: draw failed due to invalid input layout. This can be sort of the opposite problem in that you think a shader should be causing a problem like this when you draw a sprite, but it's not. And the reason for that is likely that if you're not actually referencing the input normal attribute anywhere, the shader compiler will just get rid of it. The same goes for the other attributes too. Note that this doesn't go the other way, so if you were to try to draw all of this other stuff in the world, let's see. If you were to try to, for example, draw the 3D stuff, with a shader that, let's say, doesn't use the input normal attribute, this is not going to cause the same problem, at least not on those platforms. If you try to, if you supply to the shader an attribute that it doesn't use, an attribute that it doesn't need, you're generally fine, at least on desktop. On things like mobile devices, it might be a different story, but I've never run GameMaker on a mobile device. You can see that everything is still being drawn where it is. It's just without lighting because this shader doesn't contain any lighting. But with that said, it's a good idea to not do that. It's a good idea to actually like ask for the vertex attributes that you're supplying, just as like a best practices thing. If you do want to, since sprites not having a normal makes it a little bit difficult to do 3D lighting with them, if you do want to do lighting with 3D, with sprites in 3D, you could sort of fake having a normal. Since sprites by default in GameMaker are always lying on the XY plane pointing up, you could fake it. I'm gonna call the shader basic 3D sprites with lighting. That's a bit of a mouthful, but we'll work with it. We're going to need to reset all of the uniforms like this. Because uniforms will not carry over between shaders, even if they have the same uniform. Let's see. And then if we go back to the 3D sprites with light shader, we could comment out the in normal value so that it doesn't cause problems, and then we could sort of make up a substitute. We could say vec3 sprite normal is going to be equal to vec3 0 on the x, 0 on the y, and 1 straight up in the air on the z, and then we could just use that instead, feeding that into the world normal transform. Multiply that by the matrix.
Hey.
And this should cause the sprite that's being drawn to have the spotlight shining on it. We can see it's darkened. It's not really in the light. Can I move the spotlight so that it's actually pointing like towards the sprite? What if I just increase the angle so that it's like perpendicular to the ground, or parallel to the ground rather, instead of looking down into it? Let's try running the game now. This should at least have the sprite partially in light. It's really not that bright. Okay. The light not being bright is a little bit inconvenient. I could always use like a spotlight or something. We can see it's kind of being lit, at least a little bit more than it was. Never mind. Let's see. Is there anything else to say regarding the invalid vertex layout? There's not really that much to draw fail due to invalid vertex layout. That's really all it is. All it means is that there's just you're trying to use a shader attribute that you don't have. You're trying to use a vertex attribute that you don't have in the shader. Drawing sprites with a shader that requires a lighting normal is the most common cause of that. It can happen otherwise if you're trying to use like a 3D bone animation shader on a vertex buffer that doesn't have like bone weights and stuff. That could also cause that problem. But yeah, hopefully if you've ever run into this, that will solve your problem. It's really just it's not a hugely difficult problem to solve, even if maybe the way that you solve it might depend on why you need the extra vertex attributes. So I think that's going to do it for now. My name is Michael. I like wizards and dragons and making games. If you want the code for this, look for the GitHub repository down in the video description. There's not much to it today. I have a Patreon, so if you want to contribute towards these videos being made, look for the links to that in all the usual places. You could see some fun things like your name on the end screen. About once a month I post a preview of my future plans. So if you feel like pledging, I would definitely appreciate it. Otherwise, I try to post about 2 game dev videos a week, one tutorial, and one let's make a game. So if you're interested in any of the weird things you can do in GameMaker, feel free to subscribe. Otherwise, I hope you found this useful, and I will see you all later. Special thanks to Zenjamin, Then Nothing Happens, Squarecrow, Sindra Larson, Posho, Gunnar Clovis, GameMaker, Edward Holt, DJ Gibbles, and Army Armbruster for supporting these videos. If you want to see your name in the credits or hear yourself shouted out at the end like this, head on over to the Patreon page down in the video description to join the fun.